We're starting the recording about 25 minutes into the lecture, because I blew it again, but I'll try this right later. At least it's an improvement over all previous years when I didn't record it at all. All right, so what did we just do? Why is the market efficient in the simple case? Because the price system transmits human costs in dollar form, with the result that the least money cost way of producing an automobile is also the least human cost way, because you've got to pay the workers for their labor, the other people for the other inputs they provide, and furthermore, things are only produced if they are worth producing, because each firm says, does somebody value this good at more than the cost of the inputs to produce it? If so, it's worth producing. The cost of that input is ultimately a human cost. The value is ultimately the human value to the guy who consumes the good. So therefore, we've got the right rule. Things are produced if the value to those who get them is greater than the cost of those who produce them. And everything goes to the person who values it most, because if it doesn't, the person who values it more will bid it away from it. That's the first approximation. And that looks like an elegant way of getting an efficient outcome when you've got this impossible problem of 300 million people to coordinate. Externalities mess that process up twice. First, the external cost is not included in the calculation of how to produce stuff, so that you are producing things in the way that minimizes the private cost, the cost of the producer of producing it. That includes the costs to all of the providers' inputs that he has to pay for, because he has to pay those people at least as much as the inputs are worth, but it does not include the cost of any inputs he doesn't pay for, as for example, the clean air that becomes dirty when he emits sulfur dioxide from his smokestacks. So first, he produces his steel in the wrong way. He uses high sulfur coal if it's cheaper, even if low sulfur coal produces less pollution. He doesn't put a smokestack scrubber on, even if the benefit in reduced pollution is greater than the cost of the scrubber. And second, price no longer accurately measures cost when there are externalities involved, because now the price I'm willing to sell my steel at represents all of the costs I had to pay, but not the costs that the people downwind had to pay. You can solve the first problem with regulation if it's sufficiently clever and benevolent. If you imagine a very wise and well-intentioned regulator, he can figure out, should you put a scrubber on, you have to scrub. Should you use low sulfur coal? Yes. Should he use low sulfur coal? No, it wouldn't didn't save him enough and it's more expensive. So you could imagine somebody doing that. That still leaves a second problem, because if all we do is to say you've got to take those precautions worth taking, you're still not including in the price of your good the cost imposed as a result of the fact that some precautions weren't worth taking. You're still emitting some sulfur dioxide. People, non-economists, think of the idea of the optimal level of pollution as sort of a corrupt idea. Obviously, you want zero pollution. And when anybody makes that argument, I say, well, are you concerned about global warming? Yes. So you regard carbon dioxide as a pollutant? Yes. So you're planning to stop breathing. All right. If zero pollution means you don't emit carbon dioxide, that means you don't exhale. You can breathe as long as you only breathe in. And I think that's sort of a particularly striking way of making the point that it's not that pollution is evil. It is that pollution is a cost, and like other costs, you would like to reduce it, but only if the cost of reducing it is not greater than the cost you're reducing. That's a normal case. And I should say, I'm sort of struck by the word pollution, because it's a religious term in terms of its original usage, and it still carries that emotional connotation. And you can sort of see it in some of the odder cases like thermal pollution. All right? Making a river 2 degrees warmer is not an inherently wicked act. It is a desirable act. If I am swimming in the river and it's cold, it's an undesirable act if I am fishing in the river and the fish I want to catch like cold water. And yet, calling it thermal pollution assumes away the question: is it good or bad? All right, it makes it evil rather than just a change which has good and bad consequences. All right. Pigouvian tax solves both problems. Once we say that the steel mill is liable for the damage done by its pollution, it both has an incentive to decide whether to put on scrubbers and use low sulfur coal, and in addition, it also has an incentive to charge a price which covers the cost of the pollution that it didn't prevent, because it's going to have to pay for that pollution. So that looks like a nice, elegant solution. On the other hand, it still leaves some problems. The cost done by the pollution has to be determined by the regulatory agency. You have to measure the amount of pollution. You can have it done by a court in the form of tort law, and this is one way of looking at tort. Pecuniary externalities don't count. Rent seeking does. With rent seeking, the transfer provides an incentive to take action is not worth taking. Now what's wrong with it all? And this is coming from Coase. I think on the syllabus I have a link to Coase's problem of social costs. If I don't, I'll put one there. I thought I put one up there. Is there one? Anybody notice? No. Anyway, it doesn't matter. I can put it up tonight if it isn't, because I did find a web version of that. I thought I'd put the link in. But anyway, Coase wrote this article, famous article, probably the most cited article in the field ever. And what Coase said is, look, Pigou is wrong 3 times over. To begin with, his concept of externalities is wrong, because he thinks of an externality as A imposing a cost on B. All right? But that isn't really true. What's really happening is that A and B are both making decisions, and the result of those joint decisions is a cost. And airport noise is sort of a standard example. As it happened when I was moving to this part of the country, we were looking at long distance over real estate, looking at the listings for houses, and there was one house that really struck us because it was so much underpriced. It was a very fancy, luxurious house, and it was selling for like 2/3 what it ought to be sold. And then we looked a little more carefully and discovered that it was very, very close to Manette Airport. So presumably it was under the flight path, and every 10 minutes an airplane went over your head, which people find disturbing. Well, one way of controlling the problem is to have airplanes quieter, to have them come in high and then drop down in various ways to control the noise they make. But the other way is to use the land underneath the flight path for growing wheat. Wheat doesn't mind noises. Or to use it for now noisy factories. You know, we can even hear the airplanes. To use it for something where sound isn't a problem. And therefore, if I've got a house under the flight path, and I say, look, your airplanes are imposing an externality on me, the response is, that's one way of looking at it, but really you chose to have that externality imposed on you, and we would like to worry about your incentives to get you not to build a house there, as well as their incentives not to make noise. So the first point is that an externality is not really A imposing a cost on B. It's A and B taking actions that are in some sense inconsistent, and we've got to worry about incentives for both. Might be that the best solution is for A to prevent the problem. It might be for B. It might be for neither. It might be for either. Both, each of them to do part of it. You don't know a priori. Coase's second point. Coase's first point is nothing works. That is to say, if you make the airlines liable, the result might be that people will build houses under the flight path knowing they'll be compensated by the airline under tort law, even if it would be cheaper to simply keep the flight path empty. If you don't make the airlines liable, then the airlines noise, even if the cheapest solution would be to modify the airplanes to make less noise when they were landing. So neither liability on either the airplane, the planes, or the landowners works really, because each, in some cases, gives the wrong result. That's nothing works. Everything works is to say, but wait a minute. Suppose the rule was that the homeowners under the flight path could sue the airlines for the unpleasantness of the airplanes. What would the next step be? I'm an airline, and I know that every year you send me a bill for $2,000 for the noise I make for your house. What are some of the ways I might respond other than just paying the bill, because I know you'll win in court if I don't? Any suggestions? We can do things to reduce the noise. What else might we do? Suppose we conclude that the cost of reducing the noise is less than that $2,000 times the 20 houses that are underneath the flight path. What else might we do? We might buy the houses. That's right. We might say, all right, we're going to buy you out. We're going to have to buy you at the full value, because after all, other buyers know that they can get compensated if we make noise. But that's all right, because we're going to buy the house. We're then going to do one of two things. One of three things. Either we are going to soundproof the house and then resell it. If soundproofing that's adequate to control the problem is cheaper than any of the other alternatives. Or we're going to tear down the house and use it for some noisy activity, or sell it to somebody who's deaf, or find some other use for it where the cost doesn't exist. Or we're going to resell it to somebody with an easement to make noise. We're going to resell it to somebody who agrees that he is giving us permission to make noise over that house. And then maybe he'll soundproof for that, or maybe it'll go to somebody who's deaf, because that's the person who doesn't mind that problem. So the general argument, one which is sometimes treated as if it was Coase's whole argument, though it certainly isn't, is that however you initially set it up, as long as there is some change in arrangements that produces the net benefit, there is some transaction that the parties can gain by. So as long as soundproofing is cheaper than any of the other alternatives, either the airline goes to the homeowner and says, look, we'll pay to have your house soundproofed, we'll give you a little extra money to sweeten the bar, and then we can stop paying you for damage. Or they buy the house, or you can run through different things. So the everything works part of Coase's argument is to say that if the externalities produce an inefficient result for any reason, it's in the interest of the parties to bargain away, to agree to change their behavior to the efficient behavior. The third step is it's all transaction costs, and what that says is the reason the second step doesn't solve all that externality problems is that in some cases the bargains involved would be too costly to make. So that my standard example is air pollution in Southern California. The coasian approach says, look, if the cost to people living in Southern California of air pollution is greater than the cost to all of the factories and drivers of reducing the air pollution, then the people who live in Southern California will get together and they will offer everybody who drives in Southern California a payment to agree to put on a small control device on his tailpipe. They'll offer every factory a payment to agree to stop polluting and so forth. But the problem is that runs into the public good problem, because now it requires everybody in Los Angeles to get together and pay, but I get the benefit if you pay, so why should I pay? So in fact, the transaction costs of that one are sufficiently large, just never going to happen. And even in the airline case, suppose we reverse our assumptions. Suppose we assume the airline is not liable. We assume that the airline doesn't have to pay for the sound. But suppose that quieter planes are really the right solution. Suppose that's actually cheaper than any alternative. And there are 400 people living under the flight path. In principle, 400 people get together, they go to the airline, and they say, look, we'll pay the cost of modifying your planes to reduce the sound. But in fact, we run into the same problem. The 400 of them want to do it, but everybody wants everybody else to pay for it, and it's hard to see how you organize that. So the basic third step of the coasian argument is to say the reason that these problems persist is not that there are externalities, it's that there are cases where people's actions affect each other, and where the transaction cost of coordinating to solve the problem is too high. Questions? No. All right. Let's run through the same argument in more detail. And I'll start with the nothing works stage. And this is a real English case. One of the neat things about Coase's article is that he had actually read English cases in the process of seeing why economists were misunderstanding the nature of the problem. So you've got a candy factory, and the candy factory has power equipment, which is, I think, crushing sugar or something of that sort. They refer to, I think, as mechanical mortar and pestle. and it's big enough equipment so that it vibrates the wall of the factory. People who work in the factory are used to this phenomenon. The next door neighbor is a physician. No problem. Never complained as far as we know, until the physician decides that he needs a new consulting room. And so he builds an addition to his house, which happens to consist of a new room, which is up against the wall of the factory, right against the property line between the two properties. So it's an extension to his house in the direction of the factory. So if we imagine sketching it out, here's the doctor's house. Here's the candy factory. And here's the property line. And here's the extension. Except that then up against the wall, the extension is now getting vibrations from the machinery in the candy factory, and the doctor complains that when he uses his stethoscope, whatever the thing is that you put in your ears and put it against somebody's chest, he can't hear what's happening with the patient because there's too much noise in the factory. And so the doctor does what any red-blooded litigious person would do. He sues the candy factory to get an injunction to have them stop operating their machinery. And question then is what should happen? And Pigue's answer, you would think, would be the factory is producing an externality, so the factory has to either stop producing the externality or it has to pay either a fine to the government or a damage payment to the physician in order to internalize the externalities, so that the factory will take account of the fact that it's imposing these costs and deciding whether to run its factory. All right. But as I say in the outline, if you think about that particular case, it might well be that having the doctor switch to using that room for something where quiet wasn't important and change a different room to a consulting room, or even tear down the new edition and build it on the other side, or better yet, having built the new addition to his house somewhere not against the wall of the factory, might easily have been a less costly solution than either shutting down the factory or somehow modifying its equipment to stop making noise. And so, if the rule is Pigue's rule with tort damages, there's no reason for the doctor to worry about the costs that he imposes when he builds his consulting. If you think about the general argument, I think most of us will find Coase's argument most persuasive when our intuitions about who's at fault are weak. So that you could say, well, it's true I was drunk when I was driving and I ran you down, but if you hadn't been out walking, you wouldn't have been there to be run down, so it's your fault as much as it's mine, but none of us will find that very convincing. On the other hand, if you say, well, look, I'm sorry, but you're going to have to either move or shut your kids up. Why? Well, I'm your next door neighbor. Yeah, you've been my next door neighbor for a long time. Well, I got a new business. I've started a recording studio in my house. And my recording studio has very sensitive microphones, and every time I'm in the middle of having one of my customers record a song, the cries of your baby can be heard, or maybe the noise of your kids playing ball in the backyard, and we just can't have that. You're interfering, your noise is trespassing onto my property. Shut up your kids or leave. That seems much less plausible. And yet, the basic logic, which is that the problem exists only because of choices made by both people, is the same. And you can see my other examples. They're all the same. And similarly, I could say, I really don't like red houses. Your house is visible from my window. Your photons are trespassing on my eyes. So, therefore, I'm going to enjoin you from painting your house red. Are there any cases where, in effect, people can be enjoined by their neighbors from painting their house red? Real? What? That's right. That in fact, I had a colleague who was actually, as far as I know, the first person to publish rent-seeking, Gordon Tullock, who used to say that he couldn't repaint his front door without his neighbor's permission, because he was in some kind of a housing development which had a restrictive covenant which limited things in various ways. My parents used to live in Sea Ranch, which is a fairly ritzy development up on the coast, a couple of hours north of San Francisco. And if you wanted to plant a tree, you had to get approval because they wanted the trees to be the kinds of trees native to that terrain. They didn't want any interlopers from Australia or Britain or whatever ruining the general visual impression. So in some cases, but that's of course the coasian solution, because that's a case where bargaining among the parties involved had resulted in such agreements. But in general, we aren't going to take very seriously my complaints about the color of your door. Most of the time. any case, the basic argument here is that in any case where the legal system can't tell in advance who can solve the problem at lowest cost, now the Pavlovian solution is inadequate. Because if you put the obligation on the wrong person, that person adjusts at a high cost or doesn't adjust, instead of the other person adjusting at a low cost. In some cases, the law takes account of this kind of thing. For example, if suppose that I do run you down while I'm drunk, and I do some minor damage, and 3 weeks later you sue me, and you sue me for a fortune. And why do you sue me a fortune? Well, you didn't actually bother to go to the doctor after I ran you down, and by the time your cuts got infected, and this had happened, and that happened, it was cost you $100,000 in the hospital. You lose. That is to say, as I understand it, I'm not a lawyer. The victim of a tort still has an obligation to minimize the damages, to take whatever prudent actions reduce the costs. I'm liable for the cost of your doctor's visit to get patched up after I ran you down, and for any damage done as a result, but not for the consequence if you're not liable to do it. So that's one case in which the law is in effect taking a sort of somewhat coasian view of this. Everything works. I ran it through before. If the court finds the candy factory liable, the candy factory pays the doctor to move his consulting room, or if they are clever and they anticipated the problem, they brought an easement from everybody who had property immediately adjacent to them, agreeing not to sue for the level of vibration they were doing. And then the doctor, either way, builds his consulting room on the other side of the house. Unless it's cheaper to soundproof the machinery, in which case they don't pay him to move his consulting room, they soundproof the machinery instead. Right? They don't buy an easement if the cost of buying the easement is greater than the cost to them of preventing the nuisance. Similarly, if the court finds the candy factory isn't liable, the doctor can still pay the candy factory to soundproof their stuff if that's really cheaper than the other alternatives. So one way of thinking about this problem is that it is, again, a lot of rights, each moving to its highest value user, just as before we had apples moving to their highest value user. Only now when what's moving is not an apple, it is the right to decide whether sound is made by that factory. And if that right is more valuable to the doctor, he'll either keep it if he's got it, or buy it if the factory's got it, and there's more value to the factory the other way around. So in fact, Coase was really making the simple but profound observation. Coase is strong on simple but profound ideas. That's why he's been a valuable contributor to all these arguments that rights, like things, can be traded and markets move them to uses. Indeed, if you think about it long enough, you realize that everything gets sold is really rights. You don't really own things. You really own rights with regard to things. That you might think that I own this laptop, but if I pick it up and smash it down on your head, you will conclude that I only own rights to do certain things with the laptop. Third step is it's all transaction costs. And that's one which brings in something, one of his famous examples, which we'll be seeing again much later when we look at Alexson's work on Shasta County, is the story of the rancher and the farmer. And here there are two different versions of property law, at least as they existed in the American West at different times. One of which is an open range law, which says I am free to leave my cattle free to graze. If you are growing crops and you don't want my cattle to trample your crops, it's your obligation to build a fence around your crops. And as you may know, there was a time early in the history of the settlement of the West when the standard arrangement for cattle raising was that you didn't really, in effect, own property, or you owned the property your house was on, but everybody's herds grazed freely over the landscape, and there were cattlemen's associations where all of the cattlemen would get together once a year or something and jointly have a roundup. They could tell whose cows were who by the brands on them, and I get mine, and if I see some of yours, I send them off to you, and we end up then, driving them off to the market, the one that we want to sell. So that was the case where it was legal to be a farmer, and it was legal to own land to be a farmer, but if you owned land you were farming, I, the rancher, had no obligation to keep my cattle off of it. Part of what changed that was barbed wire. That part of the reason for that system was that fencing was very expensive, because cattle are big animals, and it takes a strong fence to keep them. And so part of the reason that you eventually went from that to the modern system where you're grazing your cattle on your land and he's grazing his cattle on his land was it became considerably cheaper to build fences as a result of the invention of barbed wire. But in any case, Coase's argument was to work through in excruciating detail in the article, which, as I say, if you don't have it, I'll put it up for you to link, for you to read. was to say that if the rancher had the right, the final outcome would be exactly the same as if he didn't. Because in each case, you can work out the question of how many cattle does the rancher... You've got a rancher and a farmer. The rancher is deciding how big a herd to have. One of the costs of having a bigger herd is doing more damage to the farmer's crop. If the rancher is liable for that damage, he'll take that into account in deciding how many cattle to have. If he's not liable, he'll still take it into account because the farmer will then be willing to pay him to hold down the side of his herd in order to reduce the damage. That's sort of a simple way of putting it. And as I say, you'll be reading at some point the Coase article, so I don't think I need to go through in detail. Similarly for fencing, that if it turns out the cheapest solution is to build a fence around the farmer's property, if the rancher is not liable for the damage, the farmer builds the fence, and if the rancher is liable for the damage, the rancher builds the fence. But you get the same fence either way. Or pays the farmer to do it. That's easier. One point which various people made after Coase was to note that how you define the initial rights does affect who has to pay whom, which might matter quite a lot to the parties in question. So that if you say that I, the rancher, have the right to graze my cattle, then if the farmer wants me to keep my herd down, he has to pay me. Whereas if you say the farmer has the right, then if I want to have a larger herd, I'm going to have to pay you more money in damages for the damage that my cattle do. And it occurs to somebody at some point, since this is changing the distribution of wealth between the two parties, it might also change outcomes. Because after all, how wealthy you are affects how much things are worth to you. And if you look at Coase's example, it's not a problem. Because he's assuming that both the farmer and the rancher are growing goods for the market. So, however wealthy the farmer is, $1 is still worth $1 to him. However wealthy the rancher is, $1 is still worth $1 to him. So, each of them can simply use the price they can sell cattle or corn for as the relevant measure. But suppose that the goods involved were ones they themselves were consuming. And this is my example of the life extension pill. I assume that somebody has somehow come up with a pill which will double your life expectancy. Anybody's life expectancy. But unfortunately, they're only able to make one such pill. They stole it from the Martians when the Martians were visiting, and now the Martians have gone home again, so we can't steal anymore. people, you and me. And we both start out with incomes of $50,000 a year from some other activity. But by good fortune, I have the pill. And you say to me, I really want that pill. And I say, well, how much do you want it? And you say, I'm willing to pay you $40,000 a year for that pill. Because $10,000 I can stay alive, and I'll live twice as long. And I say, I'm sorry. I'd rather have $50,000 in the pill than $90,000 without the pill, because I want to live longer too. All right. So, efficient outcome, Coase Theorem works. I keep the pill. But if we started out assigning ownership for the pill to you, same logic goes the other way, and you get the pill. So, what that tells us in economic terms is that even in a world of no transaction costs, the initial definition of rights does affect the outcome, but you always get efficient outcomes. It's just that one of them is the efficient outcome with one distribution of wealth, and the other the different efficient outcome with a different distribution of wealth. Is that argument clear or not clear? I think I'm putting you to sleep. I'm sorry. I think it's an interesting point, but maybe you don't. All right. So, third step, which I've already gone over briefly, but let me go over more carefully, is if the coasian argument about everything works is right, namely that we'll always be arguing for the efficient outcome, then even if we had no tort law, I would still drive safely. Because we could do it in two ways. We could say, with no tort law, I don't have the right to impose risks on you. So therefore you can enjoin me from driving. And therefore I can only drive if everybody in San Jose agrees to waive his rights to let me drive, to forbid me from driving. That's all right, Coase says, because if the value to me of driving is greater than the cost imposed on them by the risk that my driving imposes, there will be a price at which they will all agree to let me drive. Alternatively, we could say, I've got the right. I'm a free man. I can drive. This is America. The right to drive is a fundamental constitutional right, even if they happen to leave it out of the Constitution. You don't like the fact that I might come through your picture window into your living room in my car? Tough luck. In that world, in the coasian framework, everybody in San Jose gets together and they go to me and they say, look, we've seen your driving. We know you like to drive. We know that the cost to you of having to take a cab every time you go somewhere is $15,000 a year. Here's $20,000 a year if you'll agree never to drive. So, coasian world, you get the efficient outcome either way. But pretty obviously, in the real world, for those examples, that's not going to work, because you have a public good problem for its dispersed cost in getting all the people in San Jose to agree to pay me to stop driving, and you have what we refer to as a holdout problem in my trying to get all of them to agree to let me drive. You can think of a variety of other problems, such as the cost of monitoring to see what's happening. So the basic conclusion here is that if transaction costs are low enough, then any initial definition of rights will give you the efficient outcome. If not, the problem is the transaction cost. And one of the things you might want to think about in deciding how to define rights, which is a large part of what a legal system does, is what initial definition will hold down the transaction costs of getting to the efficient outcome, given that we don't know to start out with the efficient outcome. And we will be spending a week or so on that problem. So it's not just one sentence throw away. Go back before I go on, since this has all been sort of me talking for a long time. People have points. If everything is obvious, fine. But if everything is not obvious, please tell me so that we can clear things up. You see the sense in which there are three steps to the argument. First, Pigou is wrong because the Pigouvian solution doesn't work, because the costs are really joint cause, not unicausal. Second, no problem. However we define the rights, rational individuals will bargain to the efficient outcome because there are gains to bargaining to the efficient outcome. That's what we mean by saying is the efficient outcome is there are net gains to getting there. Third, but bargaining is sometimes costly, and it is sometimes so costly that we'll never do it, in which case we end up where we started, back with Pigou. Stigler coined the term the Coase Theorem, or at least I think Stigler did. Coase certainly didn't. The Coase Theorem is, in a world of zero transaction costs, any initial definition of rights will lead to an efficient outcome. And it's a nice, catchy term. The problem with it is that people read the Coase Theorem and they say, I understand Coase. And they don't, because that's just one little bit, as you've just seen, in the middle of a long argument. Let me go on to an interesting point, which is that Coase plus Pigou is too much. One Englishman is enough. All right? Because suppose we have a case where the pollution from my factory does $1 million a year worth of damage to my neighbors. And because Pigou has been read by the relevant authorities, the Environmental Protection Agency says, if you keep on polluting, we're going to sue you for, we're going to fine you $1 million a year. Preventing the pollution would cost me $1.5 million a year. So the efficient outcome is that I keep polluting. What's going to actually happen? Maybe. Let's suppose I don't have very many neighbors. What's going to happen? You're a neighbor. You observe that each year I do pollution that makes you and two of your friends, who are the other people owning these luxury spreads downwind from me. Among you, you're $1 million a year off, worse off because of my polluting, and I'm keeping on polluting. I'm paying $1 million fine to the EPA. That's nothing for you. What's going to occur to you? How could you stop me getting to stop polluting? The cost of pollution control is $1.5 million. How could you get me to stop polluting? Real easy. No. What can you do that will make it in my interest to stop polluting? Not how can I stop polluting. We know that my stopping polluting costs $1.5 million. However I do it, whether it's by not producing or changing how I produce. You're the people downwind who are breathing my pollution. There are only three of you. What? That's going to make the problem harder. You can't charge me. The legal system says we're using fines, not tort damages. It's $1 million a year fine. He's already paying that fine. You guys shut up. He's obeying the law. What's your complaint? You don't have to change the law. Yep. That's right. You go to the factory and you say, look, we understand that it costs you $1.5 million, but it'll save you $1 million because you want to pay the fine. We'll pay you $550,000 a year if you will stop polluting. All right? We're better off. We're paying $550,000 and preventing $1 million a year in pollution to us. You're better off because you are getting $550,000 from us. You're saving $1 million that you were paying the state, and you're only paying $1.5 million to control pollution. So we're all better off, right? Is that an efficient outcome? Is that an efficient outcome? No. It's not efficient because we've just prevented $1 million of pollution at a cost of $1.5 million. So what's happened is that we, in this particular case, the reason I made it only 3 neighbors downstream so that the coasian bargaining could work. Three people can get together to make an offer. All right? That's why more people would make it harder, not easier. So in this case, we've got both Pigu's incentive, the fine, and Coase's incentive, the bargaining, and that's double counting. Do you see? We've got an incentive that's going to go up to twice the damage done. One from the EPA, and if necessary, the neighbors will pay $950,000 instead of $550,000. That's why I say Coase plus Pigu is too much. It's double count. Now this raises an interesting question. Coase Theorem says that with zero transaction costs we'll get efficient outcomes, but we've just got an inefficient outcome. What's wrong? Who's being left out of our bargaining? Who loses when we make this deal? I stop polluting, and you pay me $550,000. Who loses by that deal? You don't lose. I don't lose. Who loses? If it's really an inefficient change, somebody's got to be losing. You pay me $550,000 a year. I stop paying $1 million fine each year. I pay $1.5 million for pollution control. Who's worse off? My neighbors are better off. I'm better off. Who's worse off? People who are collecting that $1 million a year. Damn right. The EPA has just got to get $1 million a year from somewhere else because they aren't getting it from my fines anymore. So if you imagine a coasian approach and the government gets to bargain too, all right, then what's going to happen? The neighbors say we'll offer $550,000 if you cut it, and the EPA says, well, if you're really going to do that, we'll cut your fine to $900,000, and then we'll, and so forth on down. And it's only because I'm treating the government as if it were just a machine and not people out there that we're getting an inefficient outcome with bargaining. Very good. Correct answer. Only if the government gets bargained. So, conclusion is that Pigu's solution to the externality problem is a special case. It describes how you deal with it if we know the least cost avoider and can externally measure the damage. The Coase Theorem is special case where transaction costs are sufficiently low, and we don't have to measure the damage externally because the damage is being measured the way costs are normally measured on markets, but what people are willing to pay. All right, we don't have to have, if we imagine the coasian solution to the candy factory problem, the court never has to come in and say to the doctor, we're going to estimate how much worse off you are as a result of this noise. All they have to do is to say, if you think the cost to you of the noise is greater than the cost to them of silencing their factory, make them an offer. If you don't make them an offer, that tells us the answer to how much is worth to you. Right. So the nice thing about the coasian approach, when you can do it, is that the measurements of costs are being done inside the process, endogenously, as it were, by revealed preference. Coasian analysis, not the Coase Theorem, but Coase's analysis of which the Coase Theorem is a part, gives us the general case. You have some definition of initial rights. You have some transaction costs that will make some changes in rights costly. Not all. Some they're selling you an apple is pretty cheap. Buying permission from all my neighbors to drive is really expensive. So you have a definition of rights, a set of transaction costs affecting how you can get from that definition of rights to different outcomes, such as my driving. What inefficiencies will result? Well, we say if the rule is I can drive with nobody's permission, if the right outcome is for me not to drive, it's going to be very, very hard to get that because we'll need the transaction for which they pay me not to drive. If the rule is that I need their permission, then it's really easy to get the outcome that I don't drive because that's the outcome we're going to get. But it's real hard to get the outcome I do drive if that's the efficiency. So you could think in general of sort of the whole issue of how you define your legal rules, or large parts of it, from Coase's perspective as what do we think the efficient outcome is going to be? What are the odds of different efficient outcomes? Given each possible definition of rights, how would we get to the efficient outcome? Would we be able to do it, or would transaction costs block? That kind of way of thinking about it. Possible ways in which a court might act if it's read Coase's article and understood it. The first, the most obvious and least sensible way is that the court decides who the lowest cost avoider is and makes him avoid. So you could imagine the regulatory solution that we started with, which the court says, you put on a scrubber, you don't have to. You could imagine a court saying you are enjoined from polluting. You're not enjoined. Why are you enjoined? Because we've concluded you can prevent the pollution at a cost lower than the damage done. You're not enjoying. It's an unavoidable cost of what you're doing, and what you're doing is essential. So in order for that mechanism to work, the court or the regulator has to measure the damage, has to know enough about the cost of preventing the damage, to know who can do it at the lowest cost, and has to have the right incentives to try to do that. Second possibility, and the one which is much more interesting, I think, from our standpoint, and also usually makes more sense, is that the court makes general rules designed to make liable the party who usually will be the lower cost avoider. And the standard example of that is the defense of coming to the nuisance, which is a rule in common law which doesn't always hold, but very often holds. And the basic rule is, I build a pig farm in this nice, unspoiled rural landscape, and my neighbors are wheat, our fields of wheat. They don't mind the smell and the noise to the pigs, no problem. But way out there on the horizon is the city, and the city is growing. It's growing in this direction. And 10 years later, as the city has gotten much closer, an enterprising developer buys the wheat farm next to me and plans to build suburban houses on that wheat farm. And he then comes out to inspect his new property, and he sniffs the air, and he looks around, and he says, I don't think anybody's going to want to buy houses next to a pig farm. And so he comes to me and he says, you know, your pig farm is imposing an externality, and if you don't shut down the pig farm and convert it to some useful purpose that doesn't create problems for your neighbors, I'm going to sue you under the common law of nuisance, and the court is going to either make you pay me damages or shut down your pig farm for you. And the pig farmer says, sorry, but I was here first. My farm was here when you bought the land. My farm was here when you commissioned the architect to design your houses. My farm will still be here when you build your houses. You have come to the nuisance. And having come to the nuisance, you have implicitly accepted the nuisance. And that, as I say, is a common, though not universal, legal rule of coming to the nuisance. Is it the right answer? And the first response is yes, it's the right answer. Because after all, you could, when I put my pig farm here, no suburban development in sight, how would I know that 10 years from now you're going to want it for that purpose? Good place for a pig farm, close enough to get the pigs into the slaughterhouses in Chicago without too much traveling. My workers can go in and see the glories of the big city and go to a movie from time to time to good place for a pig farm. And it's much cheaper, instead of moving my pig farm when you decide to build a suburb, for you to build your suburb somewhere where there isn't a pig farm. After all, there's all the area around the city. Go somewhere else. That's the standard argument for why it makes sense. A different way of putting it is that as a general rule, the second mover is the lower cost of labor. Because the second mover knows the first mover is there, the first mover doesn't know the second mover is going to be there, so the first mover can't be expected to take precautions to avoid conflicts with the second mover. Perfectly reasonable. But you can imagine cases where it isn't true, and that would be the obvious case in which it was obvious to everybody that 10 years from now this is going to be a suburb. The city's been growing, it's keeping on growing. The newspaper says it's going to double in 10 years. Nobody believes that, but we know it's going to get bigger. And why did I build a pig farm here? Well, as a matter of fact, I haven't been making much money as a pig farm. I don't want to tell you. We keep this quiet. But the truth is, I've been barely breaking even as a pig farm. But boy, am I going to make a killing this year when all of the landowners around me realize their land would be worth much more for suburban development if only they weren't a pig farm here. At which point, one of two things happens. Either they buy me out at a hefty price, and that's my profit, or I buy them out at a low price, because without me they can't do anything, and then I close down my pig farm and resell the land for real estate, make a killing, and go off to Florida. All right? So you could imagine cases then where the coming to the nuisance defense wasn't the right rule for that reason. Similar arguments for the last clear chance rule. That again, the last clear chance rule, which you probably encountered in tort liability, the basic argument is that when I did something which might lead to a situation with some loss I didn't know, but at the point when all of the things that happened that had to happen in order that if you didn't step on the brakes, that guy got killed. Now you know that stepping on the brakes prevent the guy being killed. So that's the least cost way of saving his life. All right. Now we'll be getting later to the fact that we use strict liability for what are called abnormally hazardous activities, such as blasting or keeping a tiger in your backyard. And the basic argument there is that that's a case where we think it's quite likely that the lowest cost way of solving the problem is not to do it at all. And that with negligence liability, we have to say, did you keep the tiger carefully? If you did, you're not liable. But true that having a big, high fence around the tiger is a good way of keeping him from eating the school kids, but not having a tiger there is an even better way of doing it. And we want you to consider that option as well, so we make you strictly liable. That's the basic argument. We'll come back to it in more detail later. Some of the issues you may want to think about. One of them is the distinction between. Think about if you're imagining designing a legal system. And one of them is the distinction between a bright line rule and a standard. So that let's take the case that's sort of currently relevant. We've got this bright line rule which says that you can't be elected president unless you're at least 35. Now, that's obviously the wrong rule. Because all of us have known people who were older than 35 who were less responsible and intelligent than the average 35-year-old. Some of us might think some of them have been president as well, but even without that. And probably all of us have known people well below 35 who were more responsible and intelligent than the average 35-year-old. So the rule really ought to be, you have to be as intelligent and responsible as the average 35-year-old to run for president. But the short version of that rule is you can only run for president if a majority of the Supreme Court thinks you should run for president, because we don't have any objective measure of how of your intellectual and responsibility age, and therefore that's a fuzzy rule and causes lots of problems, and we're better off with a simple bright line. But there are other cases where we don't do that. Bunch of I don't know. Is the bright line rule for drinking and voting right, or should we have? You could have a literacy test for voting. They've done that sometimes. Maybe that's more relevant. You could have a rule for drinking, which basically says you can start drinking at 12, but the first time we get you get a drunk driving citation, it goes up to 21 or 30 or something. You can imagine a lot of different possible rules. But the point is only that in thinking about defining rules, that's one of the distinctions. You might also want to apply this, as we will be in considerable detail later in the semester, to defining property rights in things like land. So that you say, I think I own the land, but that's really a pretty limited form of ownership, that I can't enjoin you from shining a flashlight across it, from broadcasting radio signals through it, from flying airplanes over it. There are a whole bunch of things, and with regard to my land is limited. If I happen to own land in Pennsylvania 50 years ago, and I carelessly bought the surface estate, but neither the mineral estate nor the support estate, I not only have no legal right to keep you from mining coal under my land, I have no legal right to keep you from mining so much coal that my land collapses. That's what the support estate was about in that legal system. So in general, one of the things you might want to apply Coase's ideas to is figuring out what ought to go in the bundle of rights we call ownership of land. Why do I have the right to do A, B, and C, but not D and E? And we will be getting into that in more detail, but at this point we're running out of time, so I will